The poor young man found a wealthy woman in labor on the deserted road. He did everything he could, but when the baby was born, something shocking was revealed. Elijah walked along a narrow rural road in Illinois, feeling the afternoon sun on his back. He had come all the way from Chicago, leaving behind months of disappointment and rejection. The city had offered him no stable job. He had tried all sorts of part-time work, but nothing had lasted. He was tired of sleeping in shelters and borrowing money from friends who had none to spare. He needed to improve his family's life, and that was why he was here, walking under a hot sun, with no idea if he would find what he was looking for. He carried a small backpack with a bottle of water and a change of clothes. His shoes were worn, and his stomach felt empty. He thought about his mother and younger sister back in Chicago. They depended on him to bring in money. His mother worked part-time cleaning offices, but that paid very little. His sister was still in school, and he wanted to ensure she stayed there. He knew that if he found a job in a smaller town, maybe on a farm or at a small business, he could send money home. That thought pushed him forward. He remembered the crowded apartment they shared, the rent that kept rising, and the bills that never stopped coming. He remembered the looks of worry on his mother's face when she realized she could not pay for all the groceries. He remembered the frustration in his sister's voice when her school supplies ran out early. Elijah felt responsible for them. He was 18 now, old enough to help the family. Walking along this empty road, he thought that if he gave up, he would return home with nothing. His father had died when he was younger. It happened in a violent situation that was never properly investigated. It left Elijah feeling angry and helpless, but he tried not to think about it too much. He needed to stay focused on the future. He also thought about how difficult it had been to find work in Chicago. Some employers seemed nervous around him. He was young, black, and came from a poor neighborhood. He felt people judged him before they knew anything about him. This was exhausting, but he refused to give in to despair. As he continued walking, the scenery remained mostly the same. There were fields on both sides of the road, and a few trees offering shade. He was not sure how far he was from a town or even a small farm. He had taken a turn off a main highway earlier, hoping to find communities that might need a reliable worker. So far, he had seen no signs of life. His water was running low, and he knew he would need to find more soon. He decided that if he saw a farmhouse, he would ask if they needed help. He could do manual labor. He was not picky. He thought about his sister. He remembered her tearful eyes when he left. She asked if he was sure about leaving, and he said yes. He promised to return with a plan. He told her he would find a job somewhere else, somewhere that did not close its doors to him. He wanted to give her hope. Now here he was, alone on a dusty road. He wondered if he had made the right decision, but he knew that returning without trying would be worse. He tried to forget the many interviews he had attended in Chicago, where employers had spoken to him as if he was a risk. He tried to forget how it felt to see others getting jobs while he was turned away. He wanted to believe that people in a rural area would be different. Maybe they needed hands to pick crops or repair fences. Maybe they would pay him a small salary, but even that would help his family. He had to hold on to that thought. The sun felt hot, and he took a small sip of water. He had to save it. He did not know when he would find more. The silence around him was heavy. No cars passed by. No voices called out. He thought about stopping to rest, but he wanted to cover more ground before evening came. He had slept in uncomfortable places before, and at least out here he could rest under the open sky. He hoped it would not come to that. He hoped to meet someone soon. As he walked, he considered the possibility of turning back. But if he turned around now, he would have to face his family with empty hands and no new possibilities. That would crush him. He might as well keep going. He had nothing to lose. If he pressed forward, maybe he would find a place that needed help. Maybe He would find a town where people did not mind hiring a stranger. He tried to keep these thoughts in mind, even when his feet ached. The road stretched out with no clear end. He kept moving. He thought about all the times he had been rejected in the city. Maybe here he could start fresh. Maybe someone would give him a chance. He knew that life was not fair, but he had to believe there was an opportunity waiting for him out here. If not, what else could he do? He looked up at the telephone poles running along the road. Wires meant civilization somewhere. He had no map, but he assumed that following the road would eventually lead him to a town. He imagined finding a small diner or gas station where he could ask if anyone needed help. He would not demand much. He would take whatever someone offered. He just needed a start. With these thoughts in his mind, Elijah forced himself to keep walking. He refused to give up. He had come too far to return empty-handed. He would keep moving forward one step at a time until he found the chance he was looking for. That was the only plan he had, and he held on to it. An hour later, Elijah was still walking. His feet hurt, and his mouth felt dry. He tried to imagine what he would say if he finally met someone. He would introduce himself calmly and explain that he needed work. He would not mention his failures in the city. That might discourage them. He would say he was willing to learn and help with anything. He just needed a chance to prove himself. He hoped his honesty would matter to someone out here. He tried not to dwell on the past, but he could not forget how people had looked at him in Chicago. Some had seemed afraid of him before he even spoke. He had tried to appear friendly, polite, and respectful. Still, they turned him down. He had spent hours waiting for interviews that led nowhere. He had filled out forms that never got a response. It was hard not to feel angry, but he had to keep that anger in check. If he let it control him, he would never move forward. His stomach growled. He had eaten the last piece of bread the day before. He needed food soon. If he saw a farmhouse, he would ask politely if he could do a small task in exchange for something to eat. He knew it would be awkward, but better than going hungry. Pride would not feed him. He would swallow his pride and do what was necessary to survive. The road remained silent. He heard only the sound of his footsteps and the faint rustle of dry plants. He noticed a slight rise ahead, a small hill. Maybe after that hill, the view would change. He thought that if he could just see a sign of life, his spirits would lift. He tried not to get his hopes up too high. Still, he could not help feeling a bit excited as he approached the rise. He reached the top of the small slope and looked ahead. The landscape still looked empty, just more fields and dirt. He sighed and kept going. He considered resting, but he decided to move forward for another hour before stopping. If he found no one by then, he would rest under a tree until morning. He hoped it would not come to that. He wanted to find a place where he could earn at least a little money to send home. He focused on what he would say to a potential employer. He might say he could do physical work, clean tools, help maintain equipment, or assist with simple tasks. He had never worked on a farm before, but he would learn quickly. He would show them he was not lazy. He would show them he was determined. He had to believe this would convince someone to give him a chance. The sun moved lower in the sky, and the air felt heavier. He realized he was probably far from any main road. No cars had passed him. He felt worried. Had he made a wrong turn somewhere? He could not remember any sign that warned him this road was seldom used. He tried not to panic. He had to trust his instincts. He had chosen this path because it seemed peaceful and less crowded, and maybe that would lead him somewhere better than the busy highways had. He remembered how his mother's voice trembled when he told her his plan. She had warned him that life outside the city might be hard. He had insisted that it could not be worse than constant rejection. Now he wondered if he had been wrong. Yet he would not give up. He was not ready to admit defeat. He had to believe he was close to finding something, anything, that would help him survive. He walked faster, hoping to catch a glimpse of something besides empty fields. He thought about what he would do if he never found anyone. He pushed that thought aside. He had to stay positive. He had no other choice. He tried to remember that people must live in this region. Maybe it was just a quiet time of day, and later he would see a vehicle. After what felt like another long stretch, Elijah noticed something on the horizon. It looked like a shape that did not belong to the landscape. He squinted, trying to see clearly. It could be a building, or maybe a large object. He walked faster, eager to find out what it was. As he came closer, he realized it was not a building. It looked like a car stopped on the side of the road. His heart beat a little quicker. A car meant people. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle anyone. The car had a flat tire. The trunk was open, and a spare tire leaned against it. Whoever owned the car must have tried to fix it, but he did not see anyone right away. He looked around, wondering if the driver had left to find help. He moved closer and noticed someone behind the car. It was a woman. She was pregnant and looked to be in pain. Elijah felt a surge of concern. He took a deep breath and said hello in a calm voice. He asked if she was okay. She looked up at him, her face full of fear and discomfort. She told him she was having strong pains and could not reach anyone on her phone. She said she had tried to fix the tire, but then the contractions started. Elijah understood that this was serious. He had never helped a woman in labor before. He did not know what to do, but he knew he could not leave her there. He looked around. There was no cell service. There was no one else around. He told her his name and said he would try to help. She was breathing heavily and clutching her belly. He realized he had to stay calm, even though he felt nervous. He needed to think logically. He told her to lie down in the shade next to the car. He offered her some water from his bottle. He knew it was not enough, but it was all he had. She whispered her name, Mrs. Bennett, and explained that she needed to get to a hospital. Elijah tried to wave his arms at the empty road, hoping another vehicle would pass by. He saw nothing. He felt his heart sink, but he refused to give up. He would find a way to get her help. Elijah looked around, hoping to see any sign of assistance. There were no other cars on the road. He could hear Mrs. Bennett's breathing growing faster and more uneven. Her hands shook as she tried to find a comfortable position. The heat and dryness of the afternoon made everything feel heavier. Elijah knew he had to remain calm and think clearly. He approached the car again and examined the flat tire. He needed to change it. That was the only way to make the car drivable. If he could get the spare tire on quickly, maybe he could drive her to the nearest hospital, or at least closer to a place with cell service. He opened the trunk carefully, saw the tools, and began removing the lug nuts. He tried to work as fast as possible, but his hands were not steady. He focused on the task, ignoring the sweat dripping down his face. Mrs. Bennett cried out, saying the pain was getting worse. Elijah paused and told her he was almost done. He realized he needed to hurry, but he also needed to keep her calm. He told her to breathe slowly, in and out. He reminded her that he would not leave her. She tried to follow his instructions, but the pain seemed overwhelming. He felt helpless. He wanted to help her more, but all he could do right now was change the tire and hope he could drive her somewhere safer. He managed to remove the flat tire and put the spare in place. He tightened the lug nuts as well as he could, then lowered the car. He stood up and wiped his forehead. He felt relieved to have solved one problem. Now he needed to get Mrs. Bennett into the car. But when he turned around, he saw she was doubled over in pain. Her contractions seemed more frequent. He realized that she might not make it to a hospital if he tried driving on these remote roads with no guarantee of finding a quicker route. He knelt beside her and asked how often the contractions were coming. She tried to speak, but only managed a few words. He understood that the baby was coming soon, maybe too soon. Without cell service, he could not call for an ambulance. He looked down the road in both directions. Still no one. He wondered if he should start driving, but what if the car broke down again? Or what if she gave birth while he was driving? Mrs. Bennet gripped his arm and told him she was afraid. Elijah told her he understood, but they had to stay calm. He said he would try to flag down any passing car. He guided her to a spot under the shade of a small tree near the roadside. He placed his backpack under her head as a makeshift pillow. He wished he had more water. He offered her the last sip from his bottle. She drank it and closed her eyes for a moment. Elijah walked back to the road and began waving his arms every time he saw a movement or a shadow, hoping it might be a vehicle approaching. The silence mocked him. He wondered how such a situation could occur on a random day. He had not expected to find a woman in labor on a remote road. He had expected to find a job, not an emergency. He reminded himself that this was not about him. It was about helping her and her unborn child. He returned to Mrs. Bennet and told her to try to remain as comfortable as possible. He said that if nobody passed by soon, he would start driving slowly toward the direction he came from, hoping to find help along the way. She nodded, her face tense. Her breathing was labored, and he could see the fear in her eyes. Elijah felt pressure like never before. He was responsible for 2 lives now. Time passed slowly. He checked the spare tire, made sure it was secure. He adjusted the tools in the trunk, thinking about how to help her if the baby decided to come now. He knew nothing about childbirth, except from brief health classes in school. He felt completely unprepared. Then, far in the distance, he noticed a large truck. It was coming from the west, heading east toward them. He stood in the middle of the road and waved both arms. As the truck approached, Elijah shouted for help. The truck did not slow down. The driver seemed either not to notice or not to care. The large vehicle passed by, and a cloud of dust rose behind it. Elijah coughed and tried to clear his eyes. He walked back to Mrs. Bennet and told her the truck did not stop. She looked desperate, tears rolling down her cheeks. She said she could not bear the pain much longer. Elijah felt anger rising inside him. How could someone ignore this? But he did not have time to dwell on it. He knew he had to try again. He told her he would not give up. He went back to the edge of the road and looked in the opposite direction. He prayed for another vehicle to come by. Minutes later, he saw a second truck, smaller and older, approaching from the east. He tried the same tactic, standing in the road and waving his arms. This time, the truck began to slow down. Elijah felt relief wash over him. He had a chance. The old truck came to a stop a few feet away from Elijah. The driver leaned out the window, looking concerned. He asked what was going on. Elijah explained quickly that Mrs. Bennet was pregnant and in labor, that they had no cell signal, and that he needed help getting her to a hospital. The driver, an older man with a kind face, looked around and understood the seriousness of the situation. He got out of the truck and followed Elijah to where Mrs. Bennet lay under the tree. She cried out as another contraction came. The driver introduced himself as Carl. He said there was a hospital about 20 minutes down the road if they drove fast. He offered to take them in his truck. Elijah nodded. He quickly helped Mrs. Bennet stand up and guided her to the passenger side of the truck's cab. Carl helped from the other side, and together they got her settled in as carefully as possible. Elijah climbed into the back of the cab, holding on to the side. Carl started the engine and drove off, picking up speed as they went. The road was still bumpy, but they had to move fast. Mrs. Bennet moaned in pain, and Elijah tried to reassure her. He told her they would reach the hospital soon. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to breathe through the contractions. The sound of the engine filled the air. and Elijah focused on the passing fields, counting the moments until they reached help. Carl told Elijah that the hospital was in a small town just off the main highway. He said he usually passed through there when making deliveries. Elijah thanked him multiple times, grateful for the man's willingness to help. Carl just nodded and said he could not leave a woman in labor on the side of the road. He accelerated even more, and the truck rattled as it moved. Elijah watched Mrs. Bennett closely. She looked exhausted and afraid. He kept telling her that everything would be okay. He believed it, or at least he tried to. He had no other option. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and tried to keep track of time. The minutes felt long. Carl focused on the road, swerving around potholes and leaning forward as if to urge the truck to go faster. After what felt like forever, Elijah saw a small cluster of buildings in the distance. Carl said that was the town. He told Elijah there was a medical center there. Elijah felt relief flooding him. Soon, trained professionals would help Mrs. Bennett. He told her they were almost there, and she nodded, tears in her eyes. She looked like she was at the end of her strength, but she held on. They reached the edge of town, and Carl turned onto a paved road that led to a small hospital with a sign out front. He pulled into the parking lot, and Elijah could see a few people walking around near the entrance. Carl honked the horn. Immediately, 2 nurses came out, saw Mrs. Bennett's condition, and rushed over with a wheelchair. Carl and Elijah helped her into it. She clenched her teeth as another contraction hit, and the nurses said they would take her inside right away. Elijah followed, feeling his heart pound. He wanted to make sure she was in good hands. The nurses reassured him that she would receive the necessary care. He asked if he could wait in the lobby, and they said of course. He watched as the nurses pushed Mrs. Bennett through a set of double doors leading to the emergency area. Elijah stayed behind, suddenly feeling the intensity of what had happened. Carl patted Elijah on the back and said he had done the right thing. Elijah thanked Carl, grateful for his help. Carl said he had a delivery to make, but he would be back later to check in. Elijah nodded, and Carl left. Now Elijah stood alone in the small hospital lobby. A receptionist asked if he needed anything. Elijah said he was fine and just needed to wait. He sat down in a plastic chair and tried to catch his breath. He realized how close things had come to disaster. If Carl had not stopped, Elijah might have had to attempt to help Mrs. Bennett deliver the baby right there on the side of the road. He felt a wave of relief that it had not come to that. He still worried about her and the baby. He did not know them, but he cared about what happened to them. He had done everything he could with the limited resources he had. He waited for what felt like hours, though it might have been less. Nurses and doctors moved back and forth. He saw other patients entering and leaving. He tried not to think about the past few hours. He had come to this area to find work, but instead he found a pregnant woman in need of help. He wondered if he would ever see her again after this was over. Eventually, a nurse approached him. She said that Mrs. Bennett had given birth to a healthy baby and that both mother and child were doing well. Elijah felt tears in his eyes. He had not realized how tense he was until that moment. He thanked the nurse for letting him know. The nurse also said that Mrs. Bennett was resting and that she might want to see him later, once she felt better. Elijah breathed a sigh of relief. The crisis was over, and he had managed to get her to the hospital in time. He was glad he had decided not to give up when no one was around. He was glad he had waved down that second truck. Now he could rest a bit. He had no idea what would come next, but at least for now, he knew Mrs. Bennett and her baby were safe. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes for a moment, and thought about his family in Chicago. Maybe this strange event meant something, or maybe it was just a random moment in life. Either way, he felt proud of himself for not abandoning a person in need. That feeling would stay with him, no matter what happened next. Elijah remained in the small hospital lobby after receiving the news that Mrs. Bennet and her baby were safe. He had no money to spare, but at least the nurses allowed him to sit there as long as he wanted. He felt relief, but also a strange emptiness. He had helped her, but now what? He was still a young man with no job and no certainty about the future. He wondered if Mrs. Bennet would remember him once she recovered. After a while, he stood and walked to the front desk. He asked the receptionist if there was any update. The receptionist said Mrs. Bennet was resting and that the baby was doing fine. The receptionist did not offer much more information. Elijah understood that they might not want to reveal details about a patient to a stranger. He stepped back and took a seat again. He felt uncomfortable staying in the hospital with nothing to do. He worried about how the staff saw him. He was a young man in worn clothes and dusty shoes, sitting alone in the waiting area. He considered leaving and trying his luck in town, but what if Mrs. Bennet or someone from her family wanted to talk to him? He decided to wait a bit longer, hoping that perhaps she would send word or ask for him. Time passed slowly. Elijah looked at posters on the walls, read safety instructions, and watched people come and go. A nurse walked by and he asked her quietly if Mrs. Bennet might want to see him. The nurse said she would check. Elijah waited another long stretch. Eventually the nurse returned and said Mrs. Bennet needed to rest. Elijah nodded, feeling awkward. He did not want to bother her. He realized that he had done what he could. He helped her get to the hospital. She was safe, and so was the baby. He had no reason to stay any longer. He also had no clear next step. He had come here looking for work, not expecting any of this to happen. He checked his pockets. He had very little money left. He needed to find a place to sleep that night. He had been staying in a cheap room he had found in a nearby area days before. It was not much, but it offered a bed and a roof. He decided to leave the hospital and return to his temporary room. Maybe tomorrow he could try to find work in the small town. It did not look very big, but perhaps there was a local business that needed help. He said a polite goodbye to the receptionist and walked out into the late afternoon sun. The air felt cooler now, and he took a deep breath. Elijah walked down the street and looked at the modest buildings around him. There was a small diner, a gas station, and a few other shops. He wondered if he could ask for work, but many places were already closed or closing. He decided to return to the room he had managed to rent for a short period with the last of his savings. It was a simple place, just a small house where a kind older woman rented out one spare room. He had told her he was looking for work, and she agreed to rent him the room at a discounted rate for a few days. On his way back, he thought about Mrs. Bennet and her baby. He wondered about the child's future. The family must be wealthy, since he remembered hearing about a Mr. Bennet who was known in the region. He had heard the name before. Perhaps Mr. Bennet was a successful businessman. If that was the case, then Mrs. Bennet would recover and return to a life of comfort. Elijah hoped that the child would grow up healthy and loved. He felt no envy. He just felt curious. When he arrived at the small house, the landlady was sitting on the porch. She greeted him with a nod. He gave a small smile and went inside. His room was tiny, with a single bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto a patch of dry grass. He sat on the bed and removed his shoes, feeling the ache in his feet from all the walking he had done. He wanted to wash up, but he had to be careful with the amount of water he used. He did not want to bother the landlady. He lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He had come out here to find work, and instead he had stumbled into a crisis that had nothing to do with him. He was glad he helped, but it did not solve his main problem. He still needed a job. He still needed to send money back to his family. Nothing had changed in that regard. Yet he could not stop thinking about the events of the day. He had never been so close to a life-or-death situation. He had never held someone's hand as they were about to give birth. He wondered if this experience had changed him somehow. Maybe it showed him that he could remain calm under pressure. Maybe it proved that he was capable of caring for others, even strangers. He considered these thoughts, but in the end, he still felt uncertain. Night fell, and he managed to rest a bit. The next morning, he woke up early, hoping to try the shops in town for any possible job openings. He washed his face, put on his worn shoes, and headed out. The landlady gave him a sympathetic look, but said nothing. He walked into town and saw a few people starting their day. He checked the diner first, asking if they needed help. The owner shook his head. He asked at the gas station. The cashier said they were fully staffed. He tried a few other places with no success. He began to feel that the pattern would repeat here as it had in Chicago. He considered going back to the hospital just to see if Mrs. Bennett might ask for him, but that felt like clinging to something that was not certain. He had helped her, but he had no right to demand anything in return. By midday, he returned to his room, tired and disappointed. He lay down for a moment and thought about his options. He had a few dollars left, and he could survive a couple more days. After that, he would have to move on again. He felt the familiar worry settling in his chest. He wished something would break the cycle of rejection and insecurity. He got up and decided to buy some cheap groceries before his money ran out. While walking to a small store, he noticed a large car turning onto the street where he was staying. It looked expensive, with dark windows and a shiny exterior. He wondered who would drive such a car in this quiet town. He tried not to stare, continuing on his way. Elijah returned to the small house with a few basic items: bread, instant noodles, and a cheap bottle of water. He placed them in his room carefully. He had to make them last. He thought about calling his family, but he had no phone, and a payphone might be hard to find. Even if he called them, he had no good news yet. He decided to wait until he had something positive to share. He sat on the bed and ate a dry piece of bread. He realized that he was trapped in the same situation as before. Saving Mrs. Bennett and her baby had not opened any doors. It had been the right thing to do, and he had no regrets, but it did not solve his financial problems. He tried not to feel bitter. He reminded himself that he had not helped for a reward. He had helped because it was necessary. The day passed slowly. He tried to rest, hoping that maybe tomorrow something would come up. He considered asking the landlady if she knew anyone who needed help, but he had already asked when he first arrived, and she had said she did not know of anyone hiring. He did not want to bother her again. He decided to give it one more day of searching around town. If nothing appeared, he might have to move on. In the late afternoon, he heard a car engine outside. It sounded smooth and well-tuned. He peeked through the window and saw the same expensive car he had noticed earlier. It was parked in front of the house. He wondered if the landlady had a wealthy visitor. He heard the car door open and close. Moments later, there was a knock on the front door. The landlady answered, and Elijah heard voices. He could not make out what they were saying, but he recognized a man's voice. The tone was polite, and the landlady responded in a surprised but pleasant manner. Elijah tried not to be curious, but something told him this might be important. He continued to sit on the bed, waiting to see if someone would come to his door. After a few minutes, he heard footsteps in the hallway. The landlady tapped lightly on his door and asked if she could come in. He said yes, and she opened the door, looking a bit nervous. She said a man was here to see him, someone who asked for him by name. Elijah felt a jolt of confusion. Who would look for him here? He stood up and walked into the small living area. There he saw a well-dressed man, older than him, with a serious but kind expression. The man introduced himself as Mr. Bennett. He said that he was Mrs. Bennet's husband and that he had come to thank Elijah for saving his wife and child. Elijah stood there, not sure what to say. He had heard the name Bennet was known in the region for wealth and business success, but he never expected to meet the man himself. Mr. Bennet thanked the landlady for allowing him in. He then focused on Elijah, saying that Mrs. Bennet had explained what happened, that Elijah had found her on the side of the road in labor, had tried to help, and had managed to get her and the baby to the hospital just in time. Mr. Bennet said he was very grateful and that he wanted to repay Elijah's kindness. Elijah felt embarrassed. He said he had only done what anyone would do. He admitted he had been worried and unsure of what to do at the time. Mr. Bennet nodded, acknowledging that it must have been difficult. He said that many people would have passed by without stopping, but Elijah did not. He said Elijah's actions had saved his family from a terrible outcome. Mr. Bennet reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. He said this was a small financial gift to help Elijah with immediate needs. Elijah hesitated. He did not want to seem greedy. But Mr. Bennet insisted, saying that it was the least he could do. Elijah finally accepted it, feeling both relieved and guilty. He thanked Mr. Bennet, not sure if this would truly change his situation, but grateful for the help. Elijah expected Mr. Bennet to leave after that, but the man stayed. He asked Elijah about his life, where he came from, and what he was doing in this area. Elijah explained that he was from Chicago, that he had come here looking for work, and that things had been hard for him and his family. He admitted that he had found no real opportunities yet and was considering moving on soon. Mr. Bennet listened carefully. He did not interrupt. When Elijah finished, Mr. Bennet said he understood the difficulty of starting from scratch. He admitted that life was not always fair, and sometimes people like Elijah did not get the chances they deserved. He said that after seeing what Elijah had done for his family, he believed Elijah had good character and potential. Elijah was surprised. He did not expect Mr. Bennet to take such an interest in him. He thought Mr. Bennet would just thank him and leave. Instead, Mr. Bennet asked what kind of work Elijah wanted to do. Elijah said he would do just about anything, but he hoped for something stable, maybe with a chance to learn new skills and grow. Mr. Bennet nodded. He told Elijah that he owned a few businesses and that one of them could use a dedicated worker. He said that if Elijah was willing to work hard and prove himself, Mr. Bennet could offer him a position. Elijah's heart raced. This was more than he had hoped for. He tried to stay calm and thanked Mr. Bennet for the generous offer. Mr. Bennet added that he also wanted to help Elijah improve his future. He offered to pay for some of Elijah's education if Elijah was interested. Elijah could hardly believe what he was hearing. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he held them back. He nodded, saying he would work hard and not disappoint Mr. Bennet's trust. The older man smiled and said he would make the necessary arrangements. He asked Elijah for his contact information. Elijah explained he had none at the moment, so Mr. Bennet promised to return soon with more details. He said he wanted Elijah to settle into the job and arrange a schedule for the educational support. Elijah thanked him again. They shook hands, and Mr. Bennet left, his luxurious car driving away quietly. Elijah stood in the doorway, stunned by the turn of events. The landlady approached and said she could hardly believe it. Elijah smiled, realizing his life might actually change for the better. He closed the door and returned to his room, holding the envelope tightly. For the first time in a long time, he felt true hope. Elijah spent the rest of the evening thinking about what had happened. Mr. Bennet's visit felt like a miracle. He carefully opened the envelope and found a sum of money that would help him pay off some debts and send support to his family. He decided to send them a portion as soon as possible, so they would know he was safe and making progress. The next morning, Elijah woke early and walked into town. He found a small post office and asked about sending money and a note to his family in Chicago. He wrote a brief message explaining that he had found a wonderful opportunity. He did not give too many details, wanting to surprise them later. He sent the funds and felt relieved, knowing his mother and sister would have some support. After that, he returned to the small house to wait for Mr. Bennett's next contact. He was not sure how long it would take. He thought about looking for a temporary job, but Mr. Bennett seemed serious about offering him a position, so Elijah decided to wait a day or two. He used the time to think about his future. Maybe he could learn a skill, something that would help him build a career. He imagined working in an office, wearing clean clothes, and earning a stable paycheck. He did not have to wait long. That afternoon, a phone call came to the landlady's home phone. It was Mr. Bennett's assistant saying that Mr. Bennett wanted to meet Elijah at one of his local offices the next day. Elijah felt excited. He asked for the address and wrote it down. The assistant gave him a time to arrive and said Mr. Bennett would handle all the details. The next morning, Elijah dressed in his best clothes, which were still worn but clean. He washed his face carefully and tried to look presentable. He followed the directions and found a modest building in the center of town, with a small sign bearing the name of one of Mr. Bennett's companies. Inside, a receptionist greeted him and asked him to wait. After a short time, Mr. Bennett appeared. He smiled and invited Elijah into a private office. The room was not large, but it was neat and organized. There were shelves with files and a desk with a computer. Mr. Bennett thanked Elijah again for his actions. He said that he believed in giving opportunities to people who showed courage and honesty. Elijah listened quietly. Mr. Bennett explained the job. It would start with basic tasks at one of his local facilities, where Elijah would learn how the business operated. He would work under a supervisor who would teach him day-to-day responsibilities. Over time, if Elijah proved reliable, he could move into more skilled positions. Mr. Bennett said he understood Elijah had no formal training, but that did not matter. He wanted someone he could trust. Elijah nodded, grateful. He asked about the pay and the hours. Mr. Bennett explained that the pay would be fair for a starting position and that they could review it as Elijah gained experience. He also said he would arrange a basic training program, possibly evening classes at a local community college, to help Elijah improve his skills and perhaps earn some credits toward a degree. Elijah's heart filled with hope. Mr. Bennett handed Elijah some paperwork. Elijah read it slowly and carefully. It outlined the job duties, the starting wage, and a schedule. Elijah would work Monday through Friday, regular daytime hours with weekends off. Mr. Bennett said that once Elijah got comfortable, they would discuss educational support. Elijah agreed to all of it. He felt relieved that this was not just empty talk. It was a real chance to build something stable. Mr. Bennett also asked Elijah about his living situation. Elijah explained that he was staying in a small rented room for now. Mr. Bennett said that might be fine for a start, but if Elijah wanted to stay in the area long term, they could look into better housing once Elijah's paychecks began. Elijah thanked him and said he would handle things step by step. They shook hands. Mr. Bennett's grip was firm but friendly. He told Elijah to report to the facility in 2 days. That would give Elijah time to prepare. Elijah left the office feeling excited and nervous. He had a job now. He had security. He imagined telling his mother and sister about this. They would be proud of him. He wanted to make them proud. Over the next 2 days, Elijah arranged his belongings, made a list of what he might need, and planned his budget. He considered calling his family, but he knew that making calls was still expensive for him. He decided to send another note soon, with more details about his job. He wanted to settle into his position first and then share the entire story. When the day came, Elijah woke early, ate a small breakfast, and walked to the facility. It was a medium-sized warehouse connected to a distribution center. He introduced himself to the supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Karen, who seemed strict but fair. Karen asked Elijah about his background and told him that she expected punctuality and honesty from her workers. Elijah said he understood. Karen showed him around. There were shelves of inventory, workers preparing items for shipment, and a small office where paperwork was processed. Elijah would start by